Christian greetings to all of you this morning, and a special welcome to the visitors. For the rest of you, just for the record, I did ask Levon to preach. I thought it's about time we hear him again. He did beg off. He preached 2 out of the last 3 Sundays and is scheduled to preach again next Sunday. So I guess he didn't really give me a choice, but I understand. It is amazing today. 40 years ago, Neil and I got married. It's just, well, let's just say, even despite the fact that there are a lot of things that have happened in our lives, 40 years can go by pretty quickly, especially the 20 years when you're raising your family. I know some of you children can't understand that, but this morning, and I'd just like to thank all of you for your generosity and just the way that you have supported us in the ministry, and just the ways that you share in so many different ways. And I guess maybe someone in our family was getting something going for our 40th anniversary. So we're getting lots of cards from lots of different places, more than just from the church. So those of you who've sent them, those of you who have thought about it, we thank you for that. This morning I'd like to begin another series of sermons, and I was thinking about Bible characters in the Bible. Bible characters in the Bible, yes. How many of you have a favorite Bible character? Anyone care to share? Mine is still David, I think. Even as a toddler, I think I've told you already, I lugged this big family Bible around because there were some pictures of, believe it or not, it was one of those that I remember was David carrying the Goliath's head. I don't know what effect that had on my life, but David is still a very favorite character of mine. Anyone else have favorite characters? Character? Yes? David, good. And your middle name isn't even David, so. Anyone else? Yes, Ellie? Esther. Not Ellie, this was Ellie. Anyone else? Joseph is an amazing man. We had our discussion about him this morning. Man of integrity. Anyone else? Anyone that doesn't have a name, isn't named? Who is your favorite person in the Bible that was never named? Moses? Okay. There are lots of people in the Bible who aren't named. So, this morning I planned to, originally my title was Obscure People in the Bible. I still plan to talk about those, but the title is Living a Life of, and I should change it again, to Eternal Purpose. And part of this comes from a book that I got for my birthday. And did you ever wonder if your life has an effect on anyone? Really, you go through life, probably never had an effect on someone. This is The Butterfly Effect by Andy Andrews. He's a very prolific writer, a very good writer. And so he writes part of this. He says, in 1963, Edward Lorenz presented a hypothesis to the New York Academy of Science. His theory, stated simply, was that a butterfly could flap its wings and set molecules of air in motion, which would move other molecules of air, in turn moving more molecules of air, that eventually capable of starting a hurricane on the other side of the world. Is that possible? Is that true? Well, Lorenz and his ideas were literally laughed out at the conference. What he had proposed was ridiculous. It was preposterous, but it was fascinating. Therefore, because of the idea's charm and intrigue, the so-called butterfly effect became a staple of science fiction, remaining for decades a combination of myth and legend, spread only by comic books and bad movies. So imagine the scientific community's shock and surprise when, more than 30 years after the possibility was introduced, physics professors working from colleges and universities worldwide came to the conclusion that the butterfly effect was authentic, accurate, and viable. Soon after, it was accorded the status of a law, now known as the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. Sounds kind of made up, doesn't it? I guess it is. This principle has proven to be a force encompassing more than mere butterfly wings. Science has shown the butterfly effect to engage with the first movements of any form of matter, including people. So this morning I'd like to, as I said, like to talk about 5 people or groups of people that we know either don't know their names or know very little about them. They're obscure. So first of all, back to Bible characters. How many people do you think are named in the Bible? Just take any guesses? 2,100. That's not right. Yes? A million? That's a little high. Anyone else? If you 700? Okay. If you know this answer, this is really close to, and they both seem like way too low. Do you know how many stars you can see with your naked eye in the sky? Around 3,000. Or I think they say 5,000, and half of them over half of them we can't see because they're on the other side of the world. Well, according to the Biographical Bible, there are 3,237 Bible characters named in the scriptures, and 1,400 some of those do not have unique names. For instance, there are 4 Benjamins, 14 Josephs, and 31 Zechariahs. I didn't realize there were that many different Zechariahs. So now, of those 3,200 some, who do you think is named the most in the Bible? Now, not God. God didn't live on earth. Well, Jesus did, but who do you think was the number 1 name? Moses? No. Jacob? No. David is runner-up. There was another one here. Paul. It was Jesus, 1,281 times. David was 971 times, and Moses, and then Jacob. So we came close. So those are you can see the amounts that they were named. So today we'd like to begin with the first person we'd like to think about. The problem about talking about these people, we don't know much about them, right? Because they're mentioned, but there's just not much there. So the first person is King Saul's servant. So he asked, have you heard about David? And this passage is in 1 Samuel 16:14. I'd like to read this. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servants said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is a skillful player on the harp. And it shall be that he will play it with his hand when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. So Saul said to his servants, provide me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me. Then one of the servants answered and said, look, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him. Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them by his son David to Saul. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. Then Saul said to Jesse, saying, "Please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight." And so it was, whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play with his hand. Then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him. So how did this person, okay, remember we're also talking about how obscure people, and maybe we're putting the butterfly effect in here. How did this person, just the simple thing that he did that affect millions of people? How did it affect, how would it have affected millions of people? Well, it gave David the possibility to come to the king's house, and he started to become familiar with ruling, I guess. And his playing did bring temporary peace to Saul. And much like this servant, we never know who God plans to use and how. So as we think about the ways that our lives may affect other people, we're not talking about some great plan that I have and I'm going to go out and change the world. We're talking about just those everyday things that we do that affect other people for good and for bad. Today we're going to talk about, I don't have any plans to talk about a time when the things that we do affect other people for bad, but they can. It is a sobering thing when I think about that. But for good, just unintentionally, the things that we do can just like a snowball effect too, or a domino effect, can affect people years from now. Is that possible? And unintentionally. We don't know if this person was a godly man or not, but it really put David in a tough spot in a lot of ways. It put his life in danger, but it gave him, it affected the future. The next person is the slave of Naaman's wife. This young girl, did any of you girls ever think about what her name might be? Can you come up with a name for her? Well, we don't know. We don't know what they used to name people. And have you ever thought about, when you get to heaven, to sit down and talk to people? Who would you like to, besides Jesus, of course, who would you like to talk to when you get to heaven? Do you have any questions for Paul? Well, wouldn't it be interesting, and this is humanly speaking, earthly speaking, if you'd be sitting there and after 1 million or 2 million years, and you were talking to this person, so I don't know if we'll do this or not, but if we would, so where did you live on earth? What time period? And you would find out that it's this girl, and we don't know will she be a grown woman then? Well, she didn't die as a young girl. Oh, will there be children? Will there be babies? That's another question. But I think it'll be just really interesting you're that servant that we don't know your name. Now we know your name. I think that'll be interesting. So this story is in 2 Kings 5:1. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from that land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. You know, that verse is just a simple statement there. We don't There's no emotion, there's nothing, no distress written there. Then she said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy." And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel." Then the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. There was a little bit of miscommunication here. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, "Now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I've sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy." And it happened when the king of Israel read the letter that he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me." So it was, and I wonder when this happened, when Elisha the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean." But Naaman became furious and went away and said, "Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the rivers, the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near. There's just a couple more obscure people who made a huge difference in this story at least, and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he returned to the man of God, he and all his aides, and came and stood before him. And he said, "Indeed, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant." But he said, "As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing." And he urged him to take it, but he refused. So, how did this young girl, affect other people? It changed Naaman's life. He was still a Syrian who served the king, but he knew. He went home and he said, and I really wonder, I think the whole bad choices that Gehazi made after this kind of clouds and over, just kind of takes away from the punchline of what this little girl did. Can you imagine when she went home, or he went home, and told her? And remember, she's serving her captors. Must have been an amazing little girl. Just can't imagine how she came to be like that. Someone else had an effect in her life before this, and she waved her butterfly wings a little bit, and we don't know how many people in Syria that affected, but very many. What about the boy who gave his lunch? Do you think, some questions came to mind. Would you give up your lunch if you were in that place? Do you think he gave it up? Do you think he volunteered it? Or did the disciples say, "Hey, what do you have in that basket? I think we could use that"? I don't know. Do you think his mom and dad were there? I kind of doubt it, because if they would have been, they would have been carrying a big basket for the whole family. This story is in John 6:1. In John 6, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "There is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled the 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Then these men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." So first of all, his life, I kind of expect he volunteered it. I don't know what he had in mind, if he did volunteer it. But he at least didn't raise a fuss when someone else's suggestion was given to him. His lunch affected at least 5,000 people, plus children and women. We don't really know how many were there. But that little, well, he started something, and then Jesus, we could say, well, Jesus had this plan. He did. So which butterfly effect was, which flap was first? That's the part that we usually don't know about, is what maybe our motivations for doing things. It may seem unintentional and just, well, yes, I'll do this, or yes. But I think, as we saw in Joseph's life, as we studied in the men's class this morning, was Joseph blessed because of his integrity, or was he blessed because of God, that God was with him? Which one came first? That's really hard to tell. But in all of the things that we do, and if they affect other people, we definitely need to consider God's blessing in it and how that can affect so many more people. So people then took food home, because the disciples didn't. They even forgot to take some along on the boat trip. It tells us that. Then the men recognized that Jesus was a prophet who was to come to the world. We still talk about this miracle. And I wonder how many sermons have been preached about this story, and how the things that we, just as I'm doing now, the things that we give to God, God can bless. Lynn talked about it this morning. It's just, it keeps going. A wonderful story. Do you think he was one of the 120 in the upper room after Jesus, when the Spirit came down? I'd like to know his name. We don't know, but I expect his life definitely was changed eternally. Then there's a widow who gave 2 mites. This is a short passage, Mark 12:41. Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make 8 quadrans. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, "Assuredly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood." Thought just occurred to me in reference to what Lynn said this morning. who knows if someone didn't give her some money. And we see these, we hear these stories or see videos of people giving something to a homeless man or a homeless person. What do they often do? They will give it to someone else. A way that we just, with God's blessing involved, we can't tell what's going to come of this. Then there are the people who rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem. And this is a long passage, and I'm not going to read it. And there were many named, but they're still obscure. A few of them we might know more about, but there are lots of names that we don't know who they were. So Nehemiah went to Jerusalem, and he went on a horse ride at night to see what shape the wall was in. And so then the next day, I think he said, "You see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire." So they replied at the end here, "Let's just start rebuilding." So they began this good work. So here are just in Nehemiah 3. See all these, there are lots of names, but we don't recognize them. It says they started and they built from this section to this section. And it seems like the towers weren't thrown down, or maybe the gate posts, those were probably laid up with stone, but in between the walls were torn down. So I'm not going to read all of this. Just notice the last verse here. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. So some of them did refuse to work, but it seemed like everyone else really worked. And in verse 13 here, it talks about a group who also repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall. So I often wondered, how big a section did they work on? Well, 1,000 cubits is at minimum 18 inches per cubit, 1,500 feet, or 21 inches would be talking to about a quarter or a third of a mile, I think. That's a lot of stone to work on, to move. Then just some more people. We see there were the goldsmiths and perfume makers. I'm just looking for a few names here. Goldsmiths there at the bottom. Oh, I missed it. I thought I had them underlined. Oh, yes. Look at the last verse here. Girls, this one man didn't have any boys, so he worked, and his daughters helped. I think it's just, I love to see that. It's beautiful. Then they finished it, and we get to chapter 6 after a lot of hard times, and they even had to, they were threatened. So they finished it in 52 days. From today, that would be January 17th. So notice the effect that it had. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. And it wasn't just Nehemiah. It was all those people, except those nobles who didn't work. So it's such a, we think we might not amount to anything, what I do, and we often hear that, and it's very true. Do you remember who your great-grandparents were? You might not, probably don't. But do you recognize that maybe you're doing something that was started by those people that we don't know what they did? So I'd like to finish with a story. On Friday, April 2nd, 2004, ABC News honored a man who at that time was 91 years old. The news program was running a regular segment called Person of the Week. Usually the honorees' accomplishments are listed in advance, and by the time the name is announced, most people have already guessed the identity of this of that week's recipients. In this instance, however, the pronouncement left many viewers puzzled. And so our person of the week is, the anchorman finally said, Norman Borlaug. Does anyone know who Norman Borlaug is? Who? Who did he say? Norman. What was the last name? Yet despite our unfamiliarity, Norman Borlaug is a man who is personally responsible for drastically and dramatically changing the world in which we live. You see, in the early 1940s, Norman Borlaug hybridized high-yield, disease-resistant corn and wheat for arid climates. Maybe we call that GMO. I'm not sure. But from the Dust Bowl of Western Africa to our own desert Southwest, from South and Central America to the plains of Siberia, across Europe and Asia, Borlaug's specific seed product flourished and regenerated where no seed had ever thrived before. Through the years, it has been calculated that Norman Borlaug's work saved from famine more than 2 billion lives. 2 billion. Actually, it was never reported, but the anchorman was misinformed. It was not Norman Borlaug who saved the 2 billion lives, though very few people caught the mistake. It was a man named Henry Wallace. Who knows, have heard of Henry Wallace? Henry Wallace was the Vice President of the United States under Franklin Roosevelt. Well, Harry Truman was the Vice President, but Roosevelt served 4 terms. He had 3 different vice presidents, and the second man to serve as Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 45 was Henry Wallace. Wallace was the former Secretary of Agriculture who, after 1 term as vice president, was dumped from the ticket in favor of Truman. While Wallace was vice president, however, he used the power of that office to create a station in Mexico whose sole purpose was to hybridize corn and wheat for arid climates. And he hired a young man named Norman Borlaug to run it. So Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize. Norman Borlaug was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But considering the connection, it was really Henry Wallace that saved the 2 billion people. Or was it George Washington Carver? How many of you have heard of that name already? Yes, now the hands go up. Do you remember Carver? The peanut, right? But there's something that very few people know. When Carver was 19 years old and a student at Iowa State University, he had a dairy sciences professor who on Saturday and Sunday afternoons would allow his 6-year-old boy to go on botanical expeditions with the brilliant student. It was George Washington Carver who took that boy and instilled in him a love for plants and a vision for what they could do for humanity. It was George Washington Carver who pointed 6-year-old Henry Wallace's life in a specific direction long before he ever became Vice President of the United States. It's amazing to contemplate that. George Washington Carver flapped his butterfly wings with the peanut, and there's still 266 things we use from the peanut today. He flapped his wings with the sweet potato. There are 88 things that we still, from the sweet potato that we still use today. And while no one was even looking, George Washington Carver flapped his wings a couple times with a 6-year-old boy and just happened to save the lives of more than 2 billion people and counting. So maybe it should have been George Washington Carver, Person of the Week. Or the farmer from Diamond, Missouri. Moses and his wife Susan lived in a slave state, but they didn't believe in slavery. This was a problem for psychopaths like Quantrill's raiders who terrorized the area by destroying property, burning, and killing. And sure enough, one cold January night, Quantrill's raiders rode through Moses and Susan's farm. The outlaws burned the barn, shot several people, and dragged off a woman named Mary Washington, who refused to let go of her infant son, George. Mary Washington was Susan's best friend, and with his wife distraught, Moses quickly sent word out through neighbors and towns, and 2 days later managed to secure a meeting with the bandits. On a black horse, Moses rode several hours north to a crossroads in Kansas. There, at the appointed time in the middle of the night, he met 4 of Quantrill's raiders. They were on horseback, carrying torches and flour sacks tied over their heads with holes cut out for their eyes. There, Moses traded the only horse he had left on his farm for what they threw him in a dirty burlap bag. As they thundered off on their horses, Moses fell to his knees, and there, alone on the dark winter night, the farmer pulled from the bag a cold, naked, almost dead baby boy. Quickly, he jerked open his coat and his shirts and placed the child next to his skin. Covering him then with his own clothes and relying on the warmth from his own body, the man turned and walked that baby out. Moses walked through the night and into the next morning to get the child to safety. He sang to the child and told him he would care for him. He promised the boy he would educate him to honor his mother, whom they knew was already dead. That was the night the farmer gave the baby his name. And that is how Moses and Susan Carver came to raise that little boy, George Washington. So when you think about it, maybe it was a farmer from Diamond, Missouri, who saved the 2 billion people. Unless, was there an ending to this story? Exactly who it was that saved the 2 billion lives? Is there a specific person to whom we could point? How far back would we have to go? How many lives would we need to examine in order to determine who it really was whose action saved 2 billion people, a number that continues to increase every minute? And how far forward would we need to go in your life to show the difference you make? There are generations yet unborn whose very lives will be shifted and shaped by the moves you make and the actions you take today and tomorrow and the next day and the next. Every single thing you do matters. You've been created as one of a kind. And he doesn't mention God in here, but I'd like for you to remember what I said about the role that God plays in all of this as well. On the planet Earth, there has never been one like you, and there never will be again. Your spirit, your thoughts and feelings, your ability to reason and act all exist in no one else. The rarities that make you special are no mere accident or quirk of fate. You've been created in order that you might make a difference. You have within you the power to change the world. Know that your actions can't be hoarded, saved for later, or used selectively. By your hand, millions, billions of lives will be altered, caught up in a chain of events begun by you this day. The very beating of your heart has meaning and purpose. Your actions have value far greater than silver or gold. Your life and what you do with it today matters forever. I'd like to look at a few more I'm going the wrong way. A few more slides here. This is a verse that Paul wrote. I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. And this is what Andy Andrews said. Your life and what you do with it today matters forever. And it seems unbelievable that our lives could, affect 10, 20, 30 people, million people, billions. We think, well, that's hardly likely. But God wants us to live our lives in such a way, we often talk about living life intentionally, and that's very, very good. But I wonder if maybe it's the things that we do unintentionally that come out of who God made us to be that affect more people than some of the other things. Your life and what you do with it today matters forever. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Father God, we first of all just lift our hearts to you and in recognition of who you are. None of us would be here without you. None of us could ever amount to anything without you being our creator. And God, sometimes it's difficult to imagine that our lives will affect even this generation, much less future generations. But God, we never know. And help us to despite whether we'll be remembered or not, to live and be who you made us to be. And God, I pray that your blessing would be on our lives as we do that that people can be changed, and most of all for your honor and for your glory, that even as Naaman went home and realized that there is only one God, it's the God that the Israelites' God, help us to be faithful to you. We thank you for who you made each one of us to be, and may we be faithful to that in the small things in our lives today and every day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I have a song at this time.